Hey church family, so in the month of January we're going to talk about the righteousness of God. And as I mentioned this Sunday, the righteousness of God is both a threat to his people and it's the hope of his people. And so I'm excited about diving into this topic. Here's what you need to know. The really, really good news will be in the third week. We're going to talk about Jesus and imputed righteousness that God grants to us by faith. That's where we're headed. Week 3, tons of light. This week, a little bit of light. Next week, a little bit of light. Third week, tons of light. All right, so bear with me as we journey through this deep and dense topic in Scripture called the righteousness of God and learn what the Scriptures have to say to us. You might be wondering, based on this past week's sermon, hey, so, Alistair McIntyre says that, we live in this culture where there's no objective standard, and so it's just, there's no way of determining what's right and wrong. But isn't the problem that in past cultures and in past eras, religion was the determiner of what was right and wrong, and that didn't go very well either? You'd be right. And actually, if you want to think about sort of Western cultural history, the wars of religion that took place in Europe throughout the 1600s, the Enlightenment was sort of a response to those in a way to say, hey, the problem seems to be all these religious perspectives that can't agree on what's right and wrong. What if we could just throw out religion and throw out God and just have an entirely humanistic way of thinking that doesn't have to have a God, and we can just determine what's right and wrong based on, liberty and justice for all, to use the language of our own country's founding. It seemed like a promising endeavor for a while, but what the past century or so has shown us is that when we remove God from the equation, we don't arrive at any better moral consensus. And so what's interesting about the gospel and about the right understanding of Scripture is that the gospel is its own renewing force. So if you actually ask, how could we have a righteousness, a standard of what's right and wrong that doesn't lead to oppression and violence and selfishness? The only answer is if the gospel continues to reform us and to bring reform to the church. And so this is why actually in the history of the church, there's always been these reforming traditions and emphases that call us back to what it actually means to walk with Christ, and that call us back to the fact that God's righteousness, as we talked about this past Sunday, isn't just him being on the side of his people for better or for worse, but it's him judging his people when they are unrighteous. So the good news of the gospel is that it helps us to be always reforming. And I hope that's a factor in your life and in your household and in your gospel community as well, that you're always self-examining, critiquing your own life through the lens of what God has to say. That's how we ought to be living. And when we don't live that way, it does lead to all kinds of ugly religion. So we want to be a church that's centered on the gospel, grounded in the gospel, and that uses the gospel on our own lives and our own community so that we can stay faithful to the kind of righteous life that God requires of us and gives us through Christ. I'm looking forward to talking about all these things with you more in the weeks to come. Have a great week. Have great hope in the fact that God is righteous and loves righteousness. And we'll see you next week as we continue this journey through the Scriptures.